everyone. This is a topic I've been wanting to address for a while, basically since the day after it happened, and that's the Pittsburgh shooting. Because I have a perspective on it that I actually think a lot of people are sympathetic to, but not a lot of people are willing to state. And I think that this is a general problem in ethics and in philosophy, which is that we see it as an issue where like it needs more intellect, it needs more theory, right? That's the way philosophy is. It's all about people trying to explicate things in this absolutely intellectually perfect way. And that being contrary to that means deconstructing those arguments. And it's very, very cerebral in that way. But I think that what everyone has missed really is that in order to develop and advance human ethics, it's not so much about being able to intellectually explicate what's right and wrong, but it's being willing to say it. And I think there's a lot of forces in play that prevent people from speaking their mind. So I'm going to be offering a perspective it might be the most offensive video on my channel. If I'm going to get in trouble for anything, it's this video. So at least it won't be boring, I guess. But basically, I don't feel bad for the victims of that shooting. And I'm going to explain that right now. So Paul Elam had made a post on Facebook about how it was horrible. Basically what everybody says about it. It's a horrible thing, not okay, etc. And I made a comment responding to it. The bulk of my comment was actually in reference to a video that Luke Ford had made, because I thought he brought up a lot of really interesting points about it, which had to do with the killer's motives, and basically arguing that Christianity and most other religious groups are like equally guilty of a lot of what he was accusing the synagogue of. And I thought that was a really interesting point that was worth mentioning. But that's not what I'm really addressing here. I'll put a link to that video in case you want to explore that a little bit more fully. But the point of this video isn't to be like, oh, here's drama, here's a disagreement. The point was that the exchange to me was really thought-provoking. And I spent a lot of time thinking about it and trying to figure out like, maybe there is something I'm missing here. The short answer is I think that generally, no, I've still got it right. But in our exchange, I asked Paul Elam, I asked him in the comments section, is there anything a person could do that would cause you to not sympathize with them? And he said, yeah, doing what the killer did, right? And the implication there is that I somehow think that what the killer did is justified. To make that very clear up front, no, I do not think the shooting is actually justified. My specific claim is I don't feel bad for the victims. It's a little bit like gang violence. We have these people entering into situations where they're all culpable to some degree. You feel a little bit less bad when they get killed versus when it's an innocent victim. My primary argument is that not a single adult in that synagogue is innocent. And it's because they were all willingly, knowingly attending a sacred gang rape. And eventually the exchange ends. Paul Elam says, you lack humanity. And blocked me, basically. And again, the point isn't to have drama over it. The point, so I made a video, Radical Advocacy, about this concept of a radical MRA, because I knew ahead of time this was going to be an issue. I obviously didn't know the shooting was going to happen, but I knew that a lot of the positions that I take when I honestly state them, I do take positions that are more radical than most people, and that's just legitimately, honestly, what my perspective is. And I feel like the whole purpose of this platform, the whole idea of people just recording videos where they talk and state their opinions, that's the point of it, is that if you have a view that's a little bit different, you should be able to throw it out there so that there's food for thought so people can discuss it. So it brought me to this conception of humanity. Like, what does it mean to be humane? On a really literal level, you could say that whatever humanity does is humanity. And obviously this is not what is meant by the concept of humanity, right? Because if that were the case, we wouldn't have a concept called humane. The concept of humane would mean that a person was either too cruel or too benevolent. And obviously we only invoke this concept of humanity to say that somebody's being unnecessarily cruel. They're unfeeling, they're unempathetic, they're not sympathetic enough, they're not nice enough, they're not good enough in a sense. But it's not just good, because it's a specific aspect of the good. It's a sort of virtue that's about feeling what others feel, and about being nice and being merciful. But on one level, we can acknowledge that there are situations where being too feeling and being too kind and being too merciful can actually backfire and end up being inhumane. Like the welfare state is a great example of that. It's people just thinking with their emotions that, oh, we're going to help the poor, and they completely miss the fact that what they're doing is enabling these things to become cyclic and to continue on and onward. And in the larger scheme of things, it's actually not humane. It's actually quite, maybe not cruel, but it's insidious in a way, right? So this concept of humanity and being humane has a lot packed into it. My argument is that basically, in an application of libertarian ethics, one of the, you could call it a flaw, you could call it a feature of libertarian ethics, is that when somebody violates the non-aggression principle, other people are allowed to retaliate. And the problem with this is that when it comes to disproportionate retaliation, a lot is really left to, or, it's allegedly prone to subjectivity. Libertarianism is really, really great for defining what's right and what's wrong, but once we're in that gray area, once we have a perpetrator, then it's fucking chaos, right? Because, how do you respond to that? When you have multiple generations of perpetrators, how do we know whether or not that response is justified? How do we know whether or not that response is too much or too little? And then when you have a series of back and forths going on and on and on and on for a long period of time, basically we're all in this weird gray area where libertarian ethics technically aren't that useful because we're all guilty of constant perpetrations of violence. And then we can always just defer to that to justify bad actions, right? I would have been a perfectly good person completely in compliance with the NAP, but the fucking government ruined everything. It's sort of one way of looking at it. It's kind of a weakness of libertarian ethics, which is that it's very black and white, and it applies only to the very beginning of a conflict. Once we're in conflict, it's a lot less useful, at least at the basic level. Those are a lot more complex questions that, I don't really know the exact answers to. But the question, I suppose, comes down to whether or not you think that a person attending a bris, which a bris is a euphemism for a sacred gang rape. That's literally what they're doing. That going in there and killing a bunch of people is not reciprocal. Now, I'm going to argue not that it's justified, but that when you put it into context, you can definitely see why, I don't sympathize with those victims, particularly not the older ones. Because in all of their years of living, they never reached a moral status that said bodily autonomy matters. Permanently carving your religion onto another person's body is something you shouldn't do. They never reached that moral status. The apex of their morality is represented by their attendance to a sacred gang rape. And, maybe had they not been killed, they could have reformed themselves later. But the older they are, it's kind of doubtful. So the first thing we can do is we can flip the genders. If they're doing it to girls, most people would have this same viewpoint that I have. They'd be like, well, fuck those people. They're all complicit in a gang rape of a little baby girl. And for those of you who aren't in the know, there's multiple kinds of genital mutilation. Most of the female kinds of genital mutilation are less severe than circumcision. So that is a valid comparison. Absolutely. The only reason you think it's not a valid comparison is because of feminist propaganda that basically tricked everyone into thinking that the most severe forms of FGM was all of FGM. And of course, this was borne out in the United States when they tried to bring the absolute least severe forms of FGM into the country as sort of a compromise, and it was totally struck down. It was seen as abhorrent. So, the double standard definitely exists, and people don't make the distinction because they view any genital mutilation of girls as infinitely worse than what is done to boys. And the basic reality, this goes back to my original point, this is the reality people just don't want to plainly state. It's way easier to take up a moral stance that's politically and socially convenient, and in this case, it's basically saying, oh, well, this is socially accepted, therefore these people aren't monsters for attending this. Well, I say, no, it's a matter of fact. They in fact are all monsters. one really, really simple way to look at this whole incident is no shooter equals children harmed. Shooter equals no children harmed. Now, I don't actually know whether or not the shooter intervened in time to prevent, the genital mutilation of these infants. And there was 2 boys. I guess they were children of a gay couple. It's kind of the full gamut of like progressive bullshit thrown in there. Ironically, in order to rape boys publicly. I guess privately in the context of the gathering, but the point is that none of those people are innocent. That's my point. They're attending a sacred gang rape, and I understand that there's people within the Jewish community who really, really fight against this, and they try to promote forms of brisses that are nonviolent. And I don't want to diminish that, but I do want to say it's kind of bullshit, because the reality is these people are a bunch of baby raping monsters. And your response to that isn't to say, wow, fuck this religion and fuck all these people. I don't want anything to do with you people. I'm going to completely disavow you and completely, not identify with you at all. No, it's that they want to play king of the hill and try to push them off the top of the hill and keep Judaism for themselves. And to me, it's like, the virtue of cultural appropriation is that you can cherry pick all of the best things from different cultures and different religions without being beholden to the entirety of those things. And anytime you have to invoke a religion or invoke a culture in order to argue that something has value, the implication is that the thing itself has no value. So you culturally appropriate things when they have value in and of itself. And if something needs the overarching culture or the overarching religion to be valuable, it's worthless. So cultural appropriation is a far better religion than any religion and any culture that's ever existed. Every single person should be a diehard cultural appropriation fanboy, 100%. And the idea of authenticity within a religion, within a culture, it needs to fucking die, because if you have to invoke culture, invoke religion, it means it's garbage. And basically, my position on Judaism is the same as my position on Christianity and on Islam. They're all garbage. They're awful fucking garbage religions, because that's what enables a person to be inhumane. In libertarian ethics, you have a direct concept linking a person's actions to right and wrong. You violate a person's liberty, you violate their property, you coerce them, you lie, you murder, you steal. It's right there. And it's justified under argumentation ethics, under basic appeals to logical consistency and to reason. In religion, you have this mediator where you are looking to religion. You're outsourcing your morality to a religious body. And then you're basically trusting in that by faith. And wherever you have a legitimate justification, you don't use faith. You only use faith when you just run out of ideas. And the major religions are the ones that are named as such, but also statism. Statism is generally not considered a religion. I consider it to be a religion. The notion that a government is somehow necessary, that's a religious belief. And just as the concept of God exists is just logically self-contradictory, just because we can't conceive of what God is, in the axiomatic claim that the government is necessary. Necessary is a concept like God. It's self-contradictory. It actually makes no sense. If you really delve into that, it's completely retarded. We don't, necessary for what? What does necessary mean? People like to say that libertarians and anarcho-capitalists are utopian. This is projection, because the implication for necessary is that we live in a utopia now. And what they do is they say that anarcho-capitalism has to achieve a utopian standard. That's bullshit. That's never been the claim of any anarcho-capitalist at all. And the fact that we're not living in a utopia now, by that same standard, means that the government's not justified. What they're really making a claim to is basically a utilitarian claim, a claim that the ends justify the means, and that but for this government, things would be absolutely horrible and chaotic and essentially hell on earth. So they're making a positive claim to dystopianism, right? When in reality, under that paradigm, anarcho-capitalism would not have to be a utopia. It would have to just be either as dystopian or a little bit less dystopian than the present. So Statism is a religion, and statism and religion, basically, these are the things that mediate things, and this is what enables people to be inhumane. And because, ethically speaking, we only speak to the things that are the most morally and socially convenient, really, when you make these arguments that, we have to do the most feeling thing, we have to care about these people, it's like, you don't logically hold to that standard at all. If you really are thinking about human suffering worldwide, there's too much compassion fatigue. You can't do it. At some point, you draw a line. So the question is, where do you draw that line? And it just goes back to differences that make a difference. That's where you draw that line. And I'm not going to spend any effort caring about people who are complicit with the rape of babies. And I don't care if that puts me in opposition to a slim majority of people in America. Like, fuck those people. They're a bunch of stupid commies. They have the greatest country on the earth, and they're turning it into a socialist shithole because they're retarded. I have very little respect for Americans. I think they're fucking stupid. And they have no excuse for it either. So, that's just obvious to me. It's so obvious, and it's obvious to anyone with a frontal lobe who understands the first thing about economics and the first thing about being a genuinely humane person. It's that when a person justifies raping babies with knives, when they justify taxation, when they justify all these things, why should I have empathy and care and concern for them? They can reform themselves and they can feel apologetic, and then we can, revisit that idea. Next thing I wanted to talk about is think about soldiers and think about people who are in law and like judges. Because the state is their religion, it's a form of moral outsourcing, and that's why they have to go through a process of dehumanization in order to carry out the actions that are necessary for their roles. So in the case of a soldier, it's a lot more direct and a lot more obvious, as to the point where it's not really hidden. But when it comes to acting out law, because it's a degree removed, the enforcement class still has some of that crossover with the soldier. But really, it's still occurring at the level of judges making their decrees and following the law as it's written. Even if a law is unjust, they have to go through with it because that's the law as it was written, right? And statism as a religious mechanism is what enables that. So basically, my argument is that the real inhumanity is enabled by religion, and when people continue to support these religions, that's the true inhumanity, and that's the true violation of the non-aggression principle, and that's what causes this moral gray area and this moral chaos. So that's why I don't feel bad for the people shot in there. They were engaging in a sacred gang rape. And that's the last thing they ever did, and that's what they're going to be remembered for, at least in my book. So, thanks for listening. Hope that made sense. And you guys keep it easy.